I left her before she found someone better. Section 1. The Love That Made Us Ignore the Outside World. We used to joke that the rest of the world was just background noise, a low-frequency hum that didn't matter as long as we had our sanctuary on the 14th floor. Maya Ellison didn't just enter a room, she redefined it, and for 3 years I was the only person she allowed into the inner sanctum of her focus. We were built on a foundation of shared silence and intense, almost claustrophobic exclusivity. People like Eric Lawson would tell me we were too isolated, but I saw it as a strength. Why look for external validation when the person across the breakfast table looks at you like you are the sun? I realized quite early that our love wasn't a slow burn. It was a localized sun, blinding and brilliant, keeping everything else in the shadows. Our mornings were rituals of silence and connection, where a single glance from Maya could communicate more than an hour of conversation. She had this way of tucking a lock of dark hair behind her ear when she was thinking about our future, a future that seemed written in stone. We had discussed the house in the suburbs, the specific color of the front door, and the names of children who didn't exist yet. I stayed silent because the weight of that certainty was enough for both of us. There was no need for loud proclamations of love when our lives were so tightly interwoven that I could feel her heartbeat through the mattress. It was a perfect, sealed environment, or so I believed, until the first microscopic crack appeared in the glass. Maya was a woman of high standards and even higher ambitions, and I admired the way she moved through the world with a quiet, lethal grace. When we were out with Olivia Grant or the rest of our social circle, Maya would lean into me, her hand resting on my forearm as a silent claim of territory. It was a power dynamic we both enjoyed. I was her anchor, and she was the storm I chose to weather. I never questioned the intensity because I lived for it. I thought our exclusivity was a shield against the mundane betrayals of the modern world. How could anyone else compare to what we had built in the quiet hours of the night? That was the moment I understood that safety is often just a lack of better options. I remember one specific evening sitting on our balcony overlooking the city when Maya told me I was the only person who truly understood her. She spoke about how other men were transparent, driven by ego and shallow desires, while I possessed a depth that kept her grounded. I believed her because I wanted to believe that our bond was exceptional. We lived in a bubble of our own making, ignoring the shifting winds outside our windows. Looking back, the signs were there in the way she started checking her phone just a second too long, or how she would go quiet when certain names were mentioned. But at that time, I was still under the spell of our shared isolation. The shift was subtle, like the slow cooling of a room after the heater is turned off. It wasn't a sudden drop in temperature, but a gradual realization that the warmth was no longer being generated. I noticed that Maya started talking more about her career goals, which was normal, but the way she framed them began to change. Suddenly, it wasn't about us moving forward, it was about her, standing on a larger stage. I stayed silent, observing the way she looked at her reflection in the hallway mirror before leaving for work. There was a new hunger in her eyes, a restless energy that our quiet life could no longer contain. I didn't know it then, but the better option was already being scouted. Everything we had built was predicated on the idea that we were enough for each other. But as the months went by, I began to see the way Maya's gaze would linger on the horizon when we were out in public. She was looking for something, or someone, who could offer her a different kind of thrill. I felt the first pang of unease when she mentioned a new consultant at her firm, Jordan Hale. She spoke his name with a clinical detachment that felt practiced, as if she were trying to convince herself he was just another colleague. My intuition, sharpened by years of focused attention on her, began to whisper that the walls of our sanctuary were thinning. It is a strange thing to watch the person you love begin to audition your replacement while they are still sleeping in your bed. I began to notice the small inconsistencies, the late-night emails that required urgent attention, and the way she started dressing with a new, aggressive elegance. I didn't confront her, I simply watched. I realized that the love that made us ignore the outside world was becoming a prison for her, and she was looking for the key. I stayed silent, maintaining the facade of the devoted partner, while internally I began to map out the cracks in our foundation. The exclusivity that once felt like a privilege was starting to feel like a liability. There is a specific kind of pain in realizing that you are being outgrown. I would watch Maya during our dinner dates, noticing how her laughter had become a bit more performative, how her questions about my day felt more like a checked box than a genuine inquiry. I stayed silent because I wanted to see how far she would go before she realized I was watching her. The psychological pressure began to build, not from what was said, but from what was being withheld. Not from what was being withheld. I could feel the space between us growing, a vast, cold canyon that no amount of physical proximity could bridge. We were still us to the world, but the core was rotting. I started to withdraw my own emotional energy, not out of spite, but as a survival mechanism. I began to spend more time with Eric Lawson, reconnecting with the parts of myself I had sacrificed for the sake of our exclusivity. Maya didn't seem to notice my gradual retreat, which was the most telling sign of all. She was too occupied with her own internal transition, too focused on the new possibilities that Jordan Hale represented. I realized that the silent dominance I once held in her life was being transferred to someone else. I stayed calm, watching the inevitable unfold, with the detachment of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. As the first section of our lives together drew to a close, I stood in our kitchen, watching her prepare for a gala. She looked stunning, a masterpiece of ambition and beauty. She asked me if she looked okay, her eyes searching mine for the usual adoration. I gave her a small, tight smile and told her she looked perfect. But as she turned away, I felt a profound sense of finality. The love that had defined me for 3 years was now a ghost, and I was the only one who knew the haunting had begun. Why did she look so relieved when I didn't ask her what time she would be home? Section 2. When attention starts dividing, instead of growing. The shift in Maya's attention was not a sudden break, but a series of micro-fissures that I cataloged with a cold, clinical precision. It started with the phone, that black slab of glass that became a third party in our relationship. She used to leave it face up on the coffee table, an open book. Now it was always face down, or tucked into her pocket even when she was just moving from the living room to the kitchen. I realized that the secrecy wasn't just about protecting her privacy, it was about creating a separate world that I wasn't invited to inhabit. I stayed silent, never asking to see her messages because the silence was more revealing than any text could be. I first met Jordan Hale at a corporate mixer that Maya had insisted I attend. He was everything I expected. Polished, charismatic, and possessing an air of effortless entitlement that only comes with a certain level of status. I watched the way Maya interacted with him. It wasn't the overt flirting of a novice. It was the subtle, high-stakes mirroring of a woman who had found a new target. She laughed at his jokes with a frequency that felt unnatural, and her body language was subtly inclined toward him even when she was speaking to me. I stayed silent, sipping my drink, as I realized I was witnessing the early stages of my own obsolescence. The pressure in our home began to manifest as a polite, sterile tension. We stopped having the deep, winding conversations that had once been the hallmark of our nights. Instead, our talk was tactical, logistics about groceries, bills, and upcoming social obligations. I noticed that whenever Jordan's name came up in conversation, Maya's voice would take on a neutral, professional tone that was far too deliberate. I stayed silent because I wanted to see how long she could maintain the charade. I realized that her attention was no longer a gift she gave to me, but a resource she was carefully reallocating to someone she deemed more valuable. Vanessa Cole, Maya's closest confidant, started looking at me with a mix of pity and discomfort whenever we crossed paths. It was a subtle tell that Maya was already socializing her transition, testing the waters of her betrayal with those closest to her. I stayed silent during these encounters, offering nothing but the same calm, steady presence I had always provided. I realized that in Maya's mind, I was already becoming a memory, a comfortable safety net she could rely on while she explored the heights that Jordan Hale promised. The social imbalance was shifting, and I was the only one who wasn't pretending not to notice. I began to conduct my own silent audit of our relationship. I looked at our shared bank accounts, our lease, our social calendar. I realized that Maya was waiting for a clean moment to exit. A way to leave that wouldn't damage her carefully curated image of a virtuous woman. She wanted to be the one who fell out of love, rather than the one who betrayed. I stayed silent, continuing to play the role of the devoted partner, even as I felt the last threads of my emotional connection to her snapping. That was the moment I understood that the greatest power you can have over someone is the knowledge they think they are keeping from you. One evening, I came home early and found her in the bedroom, staring at her reflection while holding a pair of earrings I had never seen before. They were expensive, the kind of gift a man like Jordan Hale would give to mark his territory. She didn't see me in the doorway for a long moment, and in that time, I saw the true Maya. Restless, calculating, and already gone. When she finally noticed me, she didn't jump or act guilty. She simply smiled and said they were a self-gift for a promotion she was expecting. I stayed silent, nodding in approval, while internally I was already grieving the woman I thought she was. The psychological pressure of being the one left behind is designed to make you desperate, to make you cling and beg for attention. I chose the opposite path. I became even more composed, even more supportive, and even more distant. I noticed that my lack of reaction started to unsettle her. She wanted me to be jealous, to provide her with a reason to justify her wandering eye. By remaining the perfect partner, I was denying her the narrative of a broken relationship that she so desperately needed. I stayed silent, watching her frustration grow as her attempts to provoke a reaction failed one by one. I started taking late walks, leaving her alone in the apartment we had once shared with such passion. I would walk through the city feeling the cool air on my face and realize that I was already mourning a relationship that was still technically active. Maya would ask where I had been, her voice tinged with a suspicion that was actually a projection of her own guilt. I would tell her I just needed some air, and the simplicity of the truth would leave her with nothing to argue against. I realized that the division of her attention had given me a strange kind of freedom, the freedom to let go without a fight. We attended a dinner party at Olivia Grant's house, and the atmosphere was thick with unspoken truths. Jordan was there, of course, and the way he looked at Maya was a declaration of intent. I watched Maya navigate the room, her attention constantly pivoting back to him, even when she was standing by my side. I stayed silent as I saw her touch his arm, accidentally, while reaching for a glass of wine. I realized that the better option wasn't just a fantasy, it was a reality she was actively manifesting. The humiliation of being the last to know is only a burden if you choose to carry it. I had already set it down. As we drove home that night, the silence in the car was heavy, pregnant with the things we weren't saying. Maya looked out the window, her silhouette illuminated by the passing streetlights. I realized that she was waiting for me to ask about Jordan, to demand an explanation, to give her the confrontation that would set her free. I stayed silent, focusing on the road ahead, my hands steady on the steering wheel. I could feel her growing agitation, the way she shifted in her seat, the way her breathing became shallow. Why was she so terrified of the silence I was offering her? Section 3. I felt the exit before she took it. The air in our apartment had become thin, as if the oxygen was being sucked out by the growing secrets Maya was keeping. It wasn't just the phone calls she took in the bathroom or the late nights at the office. It was the way she looked through me rather than at me. I began to notice that her eyes were always searching for the exit, even when we were sitting on the couch together. I realized that the woman I loved was already living a double life, one where I was a placeholder and Jordan Hale was the lead actor. I stayed silent because there is a profound power in letting someone believe they are smarter than you. I watched her rehearse her departure in the small ways she detached from our shared responsibilities. I remember a Saturday morning when we were supposed to go to the farmer's market, a tradition we hadn't missed in years. She woke up and immediately checked her phone, a small, satisfied smirk playing on her lips before she masked it with a yawn. She told me she had a sudden deadline and couldn't go, her voice lacking the genuine regret that used to accompany her cancellations. I didn't argue or ask for proof. I simply nodded and said I'd go alone. That was the moment I understood that our shared life was no longer her priority. She was already investing her time elsewhere. The exit wasn't a door she was going to walk through. It was a slow fade she was already executing. Psychologically, the betrayal was confirmed not by a single act, but by the accumulation of absences. Maya was physically present, but her essence was elsewhere, likely in a high-end restaurant with Jordan or in a quiet bar where they whispered about potential. I started to see the subtle changes in her vocabulary, words and phrases that didn't belong to her, likely picked up from him. I stayed silent, absorbing these linguistic shifts like a detective gathering evidence. I realized that she was trying to build a new identity that didn't include me, and the pressure of maintaining the old one was starting to make her reckless. She began to leave her laptop open, perhaps unconsciously hoping I would find something that would end it for her. I spent my afternoons at the library or at Eric Lawson's place, reclaiming my own independence while Maya thought I was at home pining for her attention. Eric noticed the change in me, he said. I looked colder, but I felt more like I was simply becoming solid. I was no longer a gas expanding to fill the space she left behind. I was becoming a stone. I stayed silent when he asked how things were with Maya, offering only a vague, "We're busy." I realized that the less I spoke about her, the less power she had over my emotional state. The humiliation she intended for me was losing its sting because I refused to be a victim of her narrative. One night, I caught her in a lie so blatant it was almost insulting. She told me she was out with Vanessa Cole, but I had seen Vanessa's car parked at the gym 3 blocks away while Maya was supposedly at a gallery across town. When she came home, she smelled of a cologne that wasn't mine, something woodsy and expensive, the scent of Jordan Hale. I stayed silent as she described the art she had seen, watching the way her hands moved as she fabricated the details. I realized that she was no longer the person I knew. She was a stranger wearing Maya's skin, and the stranger was a terrible liar. Why did she think I was so blind to the obvious? The social pressure began to mount as our friends started to sense the distance. Olivia Grant invited us to a weekend getaway, and Maya declined for both of us without even asking me. She was isolating us, not for intimacy, but to prevent the us from being seen in its fractured state. I stayed silent when I found out, noting the way she controlled the flow of information to keep me in the dark. I realized that she was terrified of a public breakup before she was ready to go public with Jordan. She needed the safety of my presence to maintain her social standing while she finalized her better option. I began to realize that the better option wasn't just Jordan, it was the idea of a life where she didn't have to be the person she was with me. I was the witness to her struggles, her early failures, and her rawest moments. Jordan only saw the polished, successful version of her. I stayed silent as I watched her curate this new version of herself, wondering how long it would take for the facade to crack under the weight of her own ambition. The psychological pressure was no longer on me to keep her, it was on her to keep up the lie. I could feel the tension in her shoulders every time I walked into a room. I started moving my personal items, a few at a time, to a storage unit I'd rented. A book here, a favorite sweater there. Things she wouldn't miss because she wasn't looking at my life anymore. It was a mirror of her own behavior, a quiet withdrawal that matched her own. I stayed silent, never mentioning the disappearing items, watching to see if she would ever notice that her anchor was slowly drifting away. I realized that the more I detached, the more clearly I could see the mechanics of her betrayal. She wasn't just looking for someone better. She was looking for a version of herself that didn't owe me anything. The most painful part wasn't the cheating, whether physical or emotional. It was the realization that she thought I was too weak to handle the truth. She treated me with a condescending kindness, a pity love that felt like ash in my mouth. I stayed silent during her occasional bursts of forced affection, the way she would kiss me goodbye with eyes that were already looking past me. I realized that she was waiting for me to be the bad guy, to erupt in a fit of jealousy so she could justify leaving. By remaining calm and observant, I was denying her the exit strategy she had carefully planned. As the weeks turned into months, I felt the finality of our connection settling into my bones. I was no longer waiting for her to come back to me. I was waiting for the right moment to show her that I had already left. One evening, she asked me what I was thinking about as I stared out the window. I turned to her, gave her a calm, unreadable look, and told her I was thinking about the future. She smiled, thinking I meant our future, but I saw the flicker of unease in her eyes. Did she really believe she could replace me without losing herself in the process? Section 4. Staying physically present, leaving emotionally. The true art of leaving someone while still sharing their bed is a matter of internal architecture. I rebuilt the walls of my mind brick by brick until Maya was a guest in a house I no longer truly inhabited. I would sit across from her at dinner, nodding at her stories about the firm and Jordan's innovative strategies, while my heart rate remained perfectly steady. I stayed silent, offering the bare minimum of engagement required to keep the peace. I realized that by withdrawing my emotional labor, I was forcing her to carry the full weight of the relationship's facade. She was starting to look tired, the strain of her double life finally showing in the fine lines around her eyes. I began to treat our interactions like a business meeting. I was polite, efficient, and entirely unreachable. When she tried to initiate intimacy, I would find a gentle, logical reason to decline. A headache, a long day, a book I needed to finish. I watched the way her ego bruised when she realized she could no longer command my desire with a simple look. I stayed silent because the rejection was more powerful when it was quiet and reasoned. I realized that the power had shifted. She was now the one seeking validation, trying to prove to herself that she still had a hold over the man she was planning to discard. Jordan Hale started appearing in our life more frequently under the guise of work-related social events. I watched him try to assert dominance in my presence, talking over me or making inside jokes with Maya that were designed to exclude me. I stayed silent, offering a small, knowing smile that seemed to infuriate him. He wanted a rival. I gave him a ghost. I realized that his confidence was built on the belief that I was a clueless cuckold, and I allowed him to keep that belief. The psychological pressure on them was higher because they were performing for an audience of one who refused to react. Maya's confidant, Vanessa, tried to check in on me one afternoon, clearly sent on a reconnaissance mission. She asked if I felt Maya was different lately. I looked Vanessa straight in the eye and told her that people always change, and it's our job to adapt or move on. The coldness in my voice caught her off guard. I stayed silent after that, letting the implication hang in the air until she made a hurried excuse to leave. I realized that the word was getting back to Maya that I wasn't the broken man she expected me to be. The narrative of the poor, neglected boyfriend was falling apart. I started investing in myself in ways I had neglected during our years of exclusivity. I went to the gym, I updated my wardrobe, and I started taking a series of professional certifications that would allow me to move to a different city if I chose. Maya noticed the physical changes, and I saw a flicker of the old desire return to her eyes, a desire fueled by the fear of losing something that was suddenly becoming more valuable. I stayed silent, offering no explanation for my self-improvement. I realized that she only wanted me when she sensed I was no longer hers to keep. The atmosphere in the apartment became one of a cold war. We were both waiting for the other to drop the first bomb. I would watch her on her phone, knowing she was texting Jordan, and I felt nothing but a distant curiosity about how they would eventually fail. I stayed silent because I knew that any confrontation would only accelerate her plans and give her the emotional release she craved. By staying emotionally vacant, I was keeping her trapped in a state of perpetual guilt and uncertainty. I realized that silence is the ultimate weapon against a person who needs drama to justify their betrayals. One night, Maya came home late, clearly having had a few drinks with Jordan. She was tactile, leaning into me and talking about how lucky she was to have someone as stable as me. It was a disgusting display of manipulation, a way to soothe her own conscience. I stayed silent, gently disengaging from her touch and suggesting she get some sleep. I realized that her stability was just a word she used for the person she didn't respect enough to be honest with. The psychological distance between us was now so vast that she could have been shouting from the other side of a canyon and I wouldn't have heard her. I began to plan my final exit with the same precision she used for her better option. I found a new apartment, signed the papers, and slowly began to transfer my digital life and finances away from our joint accounts. I stayed silent about every step, maintaining the routine of our life together with a terrifying consistency. I realized that the greatest betrayal wasn't her seeking out Jordan, it was my total indifference to it. She was fighting a war I had already surrendered, and her victory was going to be a hollow, empty room. I remember standing in the living room while she was in the shower, looking at the photos of us on the mantel. We looked so happy, so exclusive. I realized that the man in those photos was dead, and the woman in the shower was a stranger I no longer cared to know. I stayed silent as she came out, wrapped in a towel, asking if I wanted to watch a movie. I told her I had work to do and went into the office, closing the door behind me. I realized that every time I closed a door between us, she felt a little more of the safety she took for granted slipping away. The section of our life where I was her safety net was officially over. I was now just a resident in her space, a silent observer of her moral decay. I watched her check her reflection one last time before bed, her expression a mix of triumph and hidden anxiety. I stayed silent as I lay down on my side of the bed, feeling the coldness of the sheets between us. I realized that she was waiting for me to break, but I was the one who had already bent the world to my will. If she wanted a better option, why did she look so haunted when I finally turned out the light? Section 5. She didn't notice I'd already let go. The most profound shift in a relationship isn't the shouting, It's the quiet. I reached a point where Maya's actions no longer triggered a pulse in my neck or a knot in my stomach. When she would return home late with the faint scent of a high-end steakhouse clinging to her coat, a place I knew she hadn't gone with Vanessa, I felt a strange, detached clarity. I realized that her deception was no longer a personal affront, but a series of data points confirming a conclusion I had already reached. I stayed silent because explaining my detachment would only give her the chance to perform a scene of fake repentance. I watched her spin her web of lies, unaware that the prey had already left the silk. I began to observe her interactions with Jordan Hale through the lens of a spectator watching a predictable play. He started calling her during dinner, his name flashing on her screen like a beacon of her new life. Maya would glance at me, her eyes darting to see if I noticed the rhythmic buzzing of the phone. I stayed silent, continuing to cut my food with a steady hand, offering no inquiry into who was calling at 8 in the evening on a Tuesday. I realized that my lack of curiosity was starting to terrify her more than any accusation could. If I didn't care enough to ask, did I still care enough to stay? The psychological pressure moved from my chest to hers, a weight she couldn't quite identify. She started overcompensating, buying me small, expensive gifts that were clearly intended to alleviate her mounting guilt. A watch, a rare bottle of bourbon, a leather-bound journal. Each item felt like a bribe to keep me from looking too closely at the gaps in her story. I stayed silent, accepting the gifts with a polite thank you before placing them on a shelf where they would collect dust. I realized that she was desperately trying to buy back the moral high ground, unaware that I had already vacated the territory entirely. I spent more time at the office, not out of necessity, but to build the architecture of my new life. I was taking meetings with recruiters in a different state, exploring opportunities that would take me thousands of miles away from the 14th floor sanctuary that had become a tomb. Eric Lawson was the only one who knew the truth. He warned me that staying in the same apartment was psychological torture, but I disagreed. I stayed silent because there was a grim satisfaction in watching Maya believe she was the one in control while I was the one holding the map to the exit. I realized that her better option was actually her biggest vulnerability. One afternoon, I walked into the living room and found her crying silently while looking at an old photo of us from our first year together. It was a calculated moment, an invitation for me to comfort her so she could feel the warmth of my forgiveness without having to confess her sins. I stayed silent, standing in the doorway for a long moment before asking if she had seen my car keys. The look of pure, unadulterated shock on her face was a masterpiece of shattered expectations. I realized that she needed me to be her emotional anchor even as she was trying to cut the rope. Why was she grieving a man who was still standing right in front of her? The social balance was tipping in my favor without me saying a word. At a small gathering, Olivia Grant mentioned how, together, I seemed lately, noting a new confidence in my posture and a sharpness in my focus. Maya, standing next to me, tried to chime in with a comment about how we were doing so well, but her voice lacked conviction. I stayed silent, letting her words hang in the air like a heavy fog until someone else changed the subject. I realized that the people around us were starting to see the cracks she was so desperate to hide. The better option was making her look fragile, while my indifference was making me look untouchable. I began to realize that Maya's plan was to wait until her position with Jordan was locked in before she staged a dramatic breakup with me. She wanted to jump from one ship to another without ever touching the cold water of being alone. I stayed silent, watching her navigate these two worlds with increasing exhaustion. She was losing weight, her sleep was fitful, and she had developed a nervous habit of tapping her nails against her wine glass. I realized that the safety I provided was the only thing keeping her from a total psychological collapse. I was the foundation of a house she was trying to burn down from the inside. I remember a night when the power went out during a storm, and we were forced to sit in a candlelit living room with nothing but our thoughts. Maya tried to start a conversation about us, about where we were going and why I felt so distant. It was the perfect moment for a confession, but she chose to make it about my emotional unavailability instead. I stayed silent, watching the flame of the candle flicker in her eyes, realizing that she was still trying to make me the villain of her story. I realized that the truth didn't matter to her as much as the narrative did. I was the antagonist in her internal movie, and she was the misunderstood heroine. I started making my move, finalizing the lease on my new place and arranging for the movers to arrive on a day I knew she would be at an out-of-town conference with Jordan. I stayed silent about the dates, the locations, and the destiny I was carving for myself. I realized that the most powerful thing I could give her was a total lack of closure. She wanted a big, messy ending to justify her betrayal, but I was going to give her a clean, quiet disappearance. The psychological pressure of an unanswered question is the most enduring form of dominance. As the section of my life as Calvin, the devoted partner, came to an end, I sat on the edge of the bed and watched her sleep. She looked peaceful, oblivious to the fact that the man she was sharing her life with was already a memory. I stayed silent as I stood up and walked out of the room, the floorboards not even creaking under my weight. I realized that I had already achieved the moral victory I sought. She was looking for a replacement, but she had already lost the original. If Jordan Hale was such a better option, why did I feel so light while she was carrying the weight of two lives? Section 6. Desire changes when safety disappears. The final weeks of our shared existence were a study in the erosion of certainty. Maya began to sense that the ground beneath her feet was no longer solid, though she couldn't pinpoint why. I had become a master of the hollow presence. I was there, I was polite, I was helpful, but I was entirely empty of the warmth she had spent years taking for granted. I stayed silent because I wanted her to feel the vacuum I was leaving behind. I realized that desire is often a byproduct of security, and as her security in me began to waver, her desire for my attention began to spike in a way that was both desperate and pathetic. She started trying to reclaim me, dressing in the clothes she knew I liked, and initiating conversations about our earliest, most passionate days. It was a transparent attempt to see if the fire was still there, or if she had finally extinguished it with her dalliances with Jordan. I stayed silent, responding with a cool, intellectual appreciation for her memories, but offering no emotional resonance. I realized that she was mourning the loss of her power over me. To a woman like Maya, a man who cannot be moved is a man who cannot be controlled, and that was a reality she wasn't prepared to face. Jordan Hale's influence on her started to wane as her anxiety about me grew. I heard her arguing with him on the phone in the hallway, her voice a hushed, jagged whisper. She was snapping at him, likely because he couldn't provide the same unwavering stability that I once had. I stayed silent, listening to the friction between her two worlds with a sense of grim satisfaction. I realized that by withdrawing my support, I had turned her better option into a burden. Without the safety of our relationship to retreat to, her affair with Jordan was losing its luster and becoming a source of intense pressure. The psychological pressure on Maya reached a breaking point during a dinner with Eric Lawson and Vanessa Cole. Vanessa made a comment about how lucky Maya was to have a man who was so patient and understanding. I saw Maya's hand tremble as she reached for her water. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for a sign that I was still hers. I stayed silent, offering only a small, polite nod to Vanessa's compliment. I realized that the humiliation was no longer mine, it was hers. She was sitting at a table with people who admired her perfect life, while she knew she was actively destroying it. I began to notice that Maya was checking my phone, a complete reversal of our dynamic. She was looking for evidence of my own betrayal, a way to level the playing field so she wouldn't have to feel like the only bad person in the room. I stayed silent, leaving my phone unlocked and prominently displayed on the nightstand. There was nothing for her to find but work emails and conversations with my mother. I realized that the lack of evidence was more damaging to her than any affair would have been. It proved that I was still the man she thought I was, while she had become someone she didn't recognize. The atmosphere in the 14th floor apartment was now one of a funeral. We were mourning a relationship that was still breathing, but only on life support. Maya would follow me from room to room, her presence a silent question that I refused to answer. I stayed silent because I knew that the moment I spoke the truth, she would find a way to twist it into a weapon against me. I realized that the only way to win was to remain the mystery she couldn't solve. Her desire for me was now fueled by a primal fear of being abandoned before she was ready to leave. I remember a specific morning when she tried to trap me into a confrontation. She asked me point-blank if I still loved her. It was a dangerous question, designed to force a yes that she could use for comfort or a no she could use for an exit. I stayed silent for a long beat, looking her in the eye with a calm, steady gaze before telling her that love is a choice we make every day. The ambiguity of the statement left her paralyzed. I realized that by refusing to give her a definitive answer, I was keeping her locked in a state of psychological limbo. She was the one who had strayed, but I was the one who held the keys to her redemption. I had already moved the last of my essential belongings into the new apartment, leaving only enough behind to maintain the illusion. I stayed silent as I packed a small bag for a business trip that was actually my final departure. I realized that the safety she had built her life on was already gone, replaced by a cold, calculating independence that she wasn't invited to share. The power shift was complete. I was the one with the options, and she was the one with the regrets. She stood in the doorway as I left, her face a mask of uncertainty. The final realization I had before walking out was that I didn't hate her. Hate requires an emotional investment that I no longer possessed. I felt a quiet, clinical pity for her. She had traded a life of deep, authentic exclusivity for a shallow audition with a man who would never truly know her. I stayed silent as I walked to the elevator, not looking back at the door. I knew I would never enter again. I realized that the better option she was looking for didn't exist, because the best version of her had died the moment she decided to replace me. As I stepped out into the crisp evening air, I felt a profound sense of freedom. The 14th floor was no longer my sanctuary. It was just a high-altitude box where a woman was realizing that the man she thought she had outgrown was the only thing keeping her afloat. I stayed silent as I hailed a cab, my mind already focused on the quiet satisfaction of the life I was about to start. I realized that the ultimate revenge isn't a loud confrontation or a public shaming. It's the moment someone realizes they lost something they can never replace. Why did she think she could have the world without losing her soul? Section 7. She looked for closure I no longer needed. The silence of my new apartment was a luxury I hadn't realized I was missing. It was a sterile, quiet space that belonged entirely to me, devoid of the lingering scent of Maya's perfume or the heavy, unspoken lies that had saturated our old home. I had left a single note on the kitchen counter of the 14th floor sanctuary, stating simply that I had moved on and that my half of the rent was covered through the end of the lease. I stayed silent because a long-winded explanation would have been a gift of attention she no longer deserved. I realized that by the time she found that note, I was already a ghost in her world, a memory that would haunt her more than any shouting match ever could. The call started within 3 hours of her return from the conference. My phone buzzed on the nightstand of my new life, displaying her name over and over again. I didn't block her, I simply let it ring, watching the screen light up the dark room like a dying star. I stayed silent because answering would mean entering her narrative again, and I was finished being a character in her play. I realized that her desperation wasn't born of love, but of a loss of control. She had expected to be the one to orchestrate the ending, to deliver the final blow when it suited her timeline, and I had robbed her of that climax. Vanessa Cole and Eric Lawson became the unwilling couriers of her confusion. Vanessa sent me long, frantic texts about how devastated Maya was, how she couldn't understand how I could just abandon 3 years of history. I stayed silent, deleting the messages without replying. I realized that Maya was trying to use our social circle to shame me back into her orbit, to make my quiet departure look like a betrayal of my own. But the psychological pressure was on her now. Everyone knew I had been the steady one, the one who stayed while she wandered. Her attempts to frame me as the villain were failing because my silence was too dignified to be refuted. A week later, I agreed to meet her in a neutral public space, a busy coffee shop downtown. I arrived exactly on time, dressed with the same precision I had used during our years of exclusivity. She was already there, looking disheveled in a way I had never seen, her eyes rimmed with red. She started talking before I even sat down, demanding to know where I was, why I had left, and how I could be so cruel. I stayed silent, watching her perform her grief for the benefit of the surrounding patrons. I realized that she was still looking for the closure of a fight, a moment where she could point to my anger and say, "See, this is why it didn't work." When she finally paused for breath, I looked at her with a calm, clinical detachment that seemed to physically push her back in her seat. I told her that there was no need for a scene. As the relationship had ended months ago, she was just the last to acknowledge it. I stayed silent after that, letting the truth hang between us like a cold fog. I realized that my lack of anger was the most insulting thing I could offer her. It proved that she no longer had the power to hurt me, and for a woman who lived for emotional intensity, that was a fate worse than being hated. She asked me about Jordan, her voice trembling with the fear that I knew everything. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a confession or a confrontation. I simply told her that who she spent her time with was no longer my concern. I stayed silent as I watched the realization sink in. She had traded me for a man who was already proving to be less than she hoped, and she had lost her anchor in the process. I realized that she was looking for a way to bridge the gap between her two lives, but the bridge was gone. She was stranded on the island of her own making, with nothing but Jordan Hale's shallow promises to keep her warm. Why did she look so small in a world she had tried so hard to conquer? The psychological pressure of my indifference was suffocating her. She tried to reach across the table to touch my hand, a reflex of the old intimacy we once shared. I moved my hand away, not with a jerk, but with a smooth, deliberate motion that emphasized the distance I had created. I stayed silent as she began to cry again, this time with genuine, quiet sobs. I realized that the better option had failed her because it was built on a foundation of lies, and now that the lies were exposed to the cold air of my departure, they were crumbling. She was begging for a second chance without ever admitting she had needed one. I stood up to leave, placing a $5 bill on the table for my coffee. I told her I hoped she found whatever it was she was looking for, but that she wouldn't find it with me. I stayed silent as I walked out of the coffee shop, ignoring her calls of my name that followed me onto the sidewalk. I realized that I didn't need her closure because I had created my own the moment I emotionally detached months prior. The power shift was absolute. She was the one looking for answers, and I was the one who had already moved on to the next chapter. I spent the evening walking through a part of the city we had never visited together. It felt fresh, untainted by the memories of our exclusive, suffocating love. I realized that the moral victory wasn't about winning her back or making her suffer. It was about the total reclamation of my own identity. I stayed silent as I sat on a bench, watching the city lights flicker to life. I realized that the danger she thought she was flirting with had actually been the safety she threw away. She was the one who had to live with the consequences of her choices, while I was free to make new ones. As the sun set on the 7th section of this narrative, I felt a profound sense of peace. I was no longer the victim of her betrayal. I was the architect of my own liberation. I stayed silent as I walked back to my new apartment, the key turning smoothly in the lock. I realized that the most powerful thing you can do to someone who betrayed you is to become someone they no longer recognize. She was still looking for the Calvin she could control, but that man was gone. If she wanted a life of intensity and better options, why did she look so lonely in the middle of it? Section 8. What revenge feels like when you're already free. True revenge doesn't look like a fire. It looks like a clean, well-lit room where the person who hurt you is no longer invited. 3 months after I walked out of the 14th floor apartment, my life had taken on a new, quiet momentum. I had accepted a senior position in a different firm, one that required me to move to the coast. I stayed silent about my move, letting the news filter through the grapevine until it eventually reached Maya. I realized that my success was the ultimate evidence of her miscalculation. She had thought I was a static part of her landscape, someone who would always be there to provide the stability she lacked. But I had proven to be a force of nature all my own. I heard from Eric Lawson that Maya's relationship with Jordan Hale had imploded within weeks of my departure. Apparently, without the thrill of the secret and the safety of my presence to return to, Jordan had become possessive and insecure, and Maya had realized he was nothing more than a polished version of the ego she claimed to despise. I stayed silent when Eric told me, offering no comment on the irony of her situation. I realized that her better option was just a mirror reflecting her own restlessness. She had destroyed something substantial for something superficial, and now she was left with nothing but the dust of her own ambition. The final meeting happened by chance at a professional conference in the city I was about to leave. I saw her across the lobby. She looked older, the sharp edges of her confidence softened by a lingering sense of regret. She approached me with a hesitant, almost shy smile, asking if we could talk for just a minute. I stayed silent, nodding my assent, and we walked to a quiet corner of the hotel bar. I realized that she was looking for a final validation, a sign that she still held some small piece of my heart so she could feel less like a failure. She told me she was sorry, not just for the mistakes, but for not realizing what she had until it was gone. It was the apology she had been rehearsing for months, a plea for absolution that she hoped would set her free from her own guilt. I stayed silent for a long moment, looking at her not with anger, but with a profound, quiet clarity. I realized that her apology was for her, not for me. I told her that I had forgiven her a long time ago, not because she deserved it, but because I didn't want to carry the weight of her actions anymore. The look of disappointment on her face was telling. She wanted my forgiveness to be a bridge back to her, but for me, it was the final brick in the wall. Psychologically, the power dynamic had reached its inevitable conclusion. I was the one who was whole, and she was the one who was searching. I stayed silent as she tried to talk about us one last time, gently steering the conversation toward her career and her future. I realized that she was mourning a version of herself that only existed when she was with me. Without my focus, she was just another person navigating a cold, indifferent world. I felt no joy in her suffering, only a quiet satisfaction in my own resilience. The revenge was simply the fact that I no longer needed her for anything. As the evening wound down, she asked if we could stay in touch, if we could at least be friends. It was the final attempt to maintain some form of exclusivity, to keep it tethered to the man she had replaced. I stayed silent, giving her a small, kind smile before shaking my head. I told her that some things are better left in the past and that our story had reached its natural end. I realized that by denying her friendship, I was giving her the only thing she truly earned, the consequences of her choices. She had wanted a different life, and now she had it, one where I didn't exist. I walked her to the lobby, the silence between us no longer heavy with tension, but light with finality. She looked at me one last time, her eyes searching for a flicker of the old Calvin, the one who would have done anything to make her happy. I stayed silent, my expression unreadable and steady. I realized that the man she was looking for was a ghost she had created, and I was the person who had survived him. She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing on the marble floor, and I didn't feel the need to watch her go. The final moral closure came not from a public victory, but from a private realization. I sat in my hotel room, looking out at the city skyline, and understood that love itself had been the mechanism of my growth. The betrayal had forced me to become the man I was always meant to be, restrained, intelligent, and entirely self-sufficient. I stayed silent as I packed my bag for the flight to my new life on the coast. I realized that the better option was never Jordan Hale or anyone else. It was the version of myself that was free from the need for external validation. As I stood at the gate the next morning, waiting to board my flight, I saw a woman who reminded me of Maya for a split second. But instead of the old ache of betrayal, I felt nothing but a cool, refreshing indifference. I stayed silent, boarding the plane and taking my seat by the window. I realized that I had won the only war that mattered, the one for my own peace of mind. The 14th floor, the lies, and the better options were all thousands of feet below me now, disappearing into the clouds. The story of Calvin Rhodes and Maya Ellison was over, but the story of a man who reclaimed his soul was just beginning. I stayed silent as the plane took off, feeling the pressure of the ascent pressing me into my seat. I realized that the ultimate power isn't in staying, it's in the ability to walk away and never look back. Why does the world feel so much larger when you finally stop trying to fit into someone else's narrow vision of it? Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe.